All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, we are back to pick up our study in the book of Revelation. Took a couple of weeks off just to cover some other things. Took a break from the book of Revelation, and now we're back, and we're going to resume where we left off in Revelation chapter 17. Chapter 17 and chapter 18 is pretty interesting. Actually, this isn't to say that anything that we've looked at thus far hasn't been interesting. Obviously, it has been. And if you stuck with me up to this point, you know just as well as I do that there's a lot of interesting things to draw and mine out of a book like this. But it seems like as we're hitting the home stretch in this book and making our way closer and closer towards the end, it just seems like things are going to get a little bit more interesting here. But with the particular chapters of chapter 17 and 18, I think are particularly interesting. Those two chapters cover the topic of the harlot or the prostitute. They both mean the same thing. And we're seeing this harlot, this prostitute, riding on the beast. And we've been introduced to the beast before. But who is this prostitute that's laid out here in these two chapters? And what does all of this have to do with wealth, materialism, affluence, all those sorts of things? That sort of arena, as far as biblical topics are concerned, we don't usually think of that and then think of the book of Revelation, I'm going to guess. But there is a connection between that and what we see in the book of Revelation. We're going to make that connection, and we're going to see how this affects the church, how it affects the church today, how it even affected the church back in the first century. So we're getting right back into Revelation. Some good things in store. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right. So, Revelation chapter 17. We're going to look at the first. Let me take a look here. The first 7 verses of chapter 17 on this episode. So we are going to get right into the text. But before we do that, you know what time it is. It is shameless plug time for my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, a book covering Jesus' words in the Olivet Discourse to his disciples. Again, like usual, I will leave a link to the Amazon page in the episode description. Go ahead and check it out. Also available on Kindle as well. Again, that's Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it, by me, Steve Gill. Okay, so we're at a point here in the book of Revelation where we're entering yet another kind of section where we're kind of seeing new visions here again. And where we're going to be entering in here is a tad bit unique, because we're introducing this character of the prostitute. And again, like I said, in chapter 17 and 18. And this is the only place where we read about the prostitute or the harlot or given a lot of details about her. I'm going to tell you straight up the bat, I keep saying prostitute or her, in the singular, but let's lay out right now, and we'll talk a little bit about this, a little bit later, but we're not talking about a single individual. Just like when we were talking about the beast earlier, which again, makes his appearance again here in this chapter, isn't talking about a single individual. The same is true for the prostitute, for the harlot. Okay. And so some interesting things. And what I want to do, like I said, we're just going to look at the first 7 verses of this chapter, but I'm going to read the entire chapter of chapter 17. So we have a full picture and a full understanding, at least as far as this chapter goes, of what we're dealing with. So Revelation chapter 17, starting in verse 1, and it says, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers of the earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit to go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads and 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For the Lord is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And the angel said to me, "The waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they are the beast. They and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind, and handing over their royal power to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." Okay, so a lot there, and again, that's 18 verses of this chapter. And like I said, we're going to look at verses 1 through 7 initially here on this episode. And as you see it, if you notice and you remember, if you notice there at the very beginning of this chapter here, where it says, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me." Now that calls to mind, and I know it's been a couple of weeks, but it's mentioning that one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls. Several weeks ago, and I say several because, again, we took the last 2 weeks to take a break from Revelation. Before that point, we spent 3 weeks in chapter 16, which outlines the 7 bowl judgments, which we saw were universal judgments that unlike the trumpet judgments and the seal judgments, they were not partial. They covered everything. Okay. And we went through those things. We saw how they parallel to this Mosaic theme and how we were to draw our minds back to the things of the Exodus and everything. And when we got to the end of chapter 16, we got to if I remember the numbers correctly, the 4th vision of the end in verses 17 through 21. Which again we've just like the 4th, we've seen 3 others before then, different pictures, different camera angles of the end of the age when Jesus Christ comes back. And so we look at different features and different emphases in these different visions of the end. And so, like I said, in chapter 16, verses 17 through 21, we saw the 4th vision of the end. So now that we have another vision of the end here, we're starting again in another vision. Now, I'm going to say here, again, unlike a lot of the other visions that we've seen before, when we start a kind of a new vision from another angle, unlike a lot of those that we've looked at in this book, this one that we're picking up here it kind of picks up sort of near the end, kind of the same way that chapters 15 and 16 did. Okay. Because when we're dealing with the prostitute, or we're dealing with the harlot, we are dealing with a character, so to speak. And again, she's a symbolic character, and that's not saying that there's anything fictional here. It's just a symbol that points to a reality. Now, we're going to talk about what that reality is as we unpack this passage. Okay. But it's this whole thing with the harlot, with the prostitute. We're going to find out who she is, what she's been up to, and this isn't going to be until later on in the chapter. And of course, you see this because we just read it here. The prostitute's downfall, and I think that's really what this is eventually going to zero in on. So we're going to see kind of what the prostitute has been up to, and a lot of the focus, I think, is taking the reader's mind to what's going to happen right at the end. And specifically, this is with the prostitute, the destruction of the prostitute. Okay, not so much the beast. We'll get to the beast destruction in the end in another camera angle, in another vision. Okay, so hopefully you've been able to see, how recapitulation in the book of Revelation has worked. And hopefully, if you've been with me through this study, you've been able to see how a straight chronological understanding of Revelation doesn't work. And I think this is by design. You see recapitulation where we see different features in these different visions. Okay. So in this particular vision, and what we're going to see, we're let in on the harlot, or the prostitute. My ESV here says prostitute. My mind keeps saying harlot. It latches on harlot, and that's not a big deal. It's the same thing. So but just so you know, we're using those terms interchangeably here. So this angel, again, as it says here, this is one of the angels, as we're seeing here in chapter 17. One of the angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute." Now, there's your first clue. And along with other clues, again, that we'll go into greater detail on later on in the chapter, we understand and we see that this is a judgment that happens at the end. So really, again, as in this next vision, we're fast forwarded to not so much things in human history between the first and second comings of Christ, but what we're working our way towards is the judgment of the prostitute. So we still have more things as far as judgment goes to read about and observe in this book, and we're going to see it as it relates to the prostitute. Now, for our purposes on this episode today, we're just going to be talking about who the prostitute is and what she's up to. And trust me, she's up to no good, and that because again, we read the entire chapter just a few minutes ago. But he says, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters." Okay. Now, this whole thing with many waters, is interesting, for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're told what the many waters represent. There isn't any guesswork or anything that's required, as far as understanding what the waters are. If you heard when we were reading through the chapter, in verse 15, we're told what the waters were. It says, "And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages." Okay, so this prostitute is seated on many waters, and the many waters are nations and tribes and peoples and languages and that sort of thing. It's a designation of people all over the world that we've become very used to in the book of Revelation. We've seen it all over the place. Okay, most of the time, it's in reference to reference to unbelievers, another designation for unbelievers, as well as designations such as dwellers of the earth, which we'll see again here in chapter 17. But in one or two other areas, the nations, tribes, peoples, languages, and things, it speaks of a remnant of believers who have come to know the Lord Jesus Christ. That's not what we're talking about here in chapter 17. We're talking about the former description of that rather than the latter. Okay, so you have this prostitute who sits on many waters, and the many waters, again, also I think points to something that we're going to see pretty clearly, I think, in much of this passage, and that is things having to do with the prostitute's riches and wealth, again, one of the interesting features of this is that when you're talking about something on many waters, that's something that's pulled, in similar language is used in places like Jeremiah chapter 51. And if you were to look at Jeremiah 51, and this is a chapter, actually chapters 50 and 51, having to do with Babylon and the judgment of Babylon and that sort of thing. Listen to this description in verse 13 of Jeremiah 51. It says, "O you who dwell on many waters, rich in treasures, your end has come. The thread of your life is cut." Okay, so there we see the whole thing of dwelling by many waters and the riches of treasure are kind of connected. And that's no wonder, because as we see here with the prostitute, and as we've seen when we read through the chapter, this prostitute, this harlot, is decked out. The picture that we're supposed to see of this woman is somebody who is wealthy herself, and the allure of her is her wealth. And she's inviting people into herself, so to speak, alluring them with the whole thing of riches and wealth and all those sorts of things. So that's where the wealth, that's where the materialism and that sort of thing, that's where we kind of start to make the connection. We'll talk a little bit more about this and even what that has to do with the church here a little bit later. But again, Jeremiah 51, talking about Babylon, and that's interesting because as we saw there in verse 5, what's written on the prostitute's forehead is Babylon the Great. Okay, so I don't think that that's a coincidence here. So again, we'll talk about how Babylon fits into all of this. We've kind of talked about Babylon a little bit. This isn't the first time that Babylon the Great has appeared in the book of Revelation. So it's just going to be a matter of reminder of what we've seen as it relates to Babylon the Great. Okay, but let's just have it in our minds right now that when it's talking about this great prostitute who is seated on many waters, we're just in that term, we're starting to be introduced to this idea of this prostitute who operates in wealth. And the reason why you have many waters and that being connected to wealth, which again is connected, the many waters is nations, tribes, peoples, and languages. Is because, if you think about ancient Babylon was a rich and ancient civilization. And one of the reasons for that was it had superior water access to so many nations and peoples and that sort of thing. So it was able to conduct business on a very wide scale. Okay, and so commerce by water and everything like that was, if you had that, then you were in pretty good shape. And Babylon was a nation that actually had that. So that's why you can make this connection to Babylon and riches, having to do with many waters. I mean, so really what we're talking about here, not only are we talking about riches and wealth and affluence, but we're talking about business dealings, economic prosperity, those sorts of things. And I just let me just lay out right now, and I'll probably remind you of this a little bit later here. But if we're talking about things like business, commerce, and like I just said before, economic prosperity and those sorts of things, I'm not saying, and this passage isn't something to say that economic prosperity, wealth, and those sorts of things are in and of themselves bad. Let's just lay that out right now, because it can be easy to think the opposite. and say that, oh, those are things that you should avoid at all costs, because we're seeing these things associated with the prostitute, who's clearly a bad actor, a bad character within this drama, within these two chapters. We're going to see, it's not just the things in and of themselves. Those things in and of themselves aren't bad, but it's what's behind those things, in which the prostitute is trying to operate here, that we see is where the evil really lies. Okay, so but let's just have it in our minds here. This whole thing of riches and economic prosperity due to successful commerce because you are on many waters, that sort of thing, which again is just talking about connections to other nations, many nations and languages and peoples and that sort of thing. Okay, so the angel says, "Come, and I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters." Now, verse 2, "with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality." Okay, so here again is another clue of what we're dealing with as it relates to wealth and prosperity and riches, and that sort of thing. And the fact that the kings of the earth enter into her, that they go into her, okay, gives you a little bit of a clue. Now, that's not exclusive to people like that. But again, I think the idea that we're supposed to get thus far is that this is dealings a lot of, with riches and wealth, and her encounters are with people who are wealthy, namely, but again, not exclusively, the kings of the earth, and the kings of the earth, in a pursuit to become even more wealthy, to become even more rich, and that sort of thing. But here's the thing, though. As it says here, as it goes on to say, it says, "with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality." Now there's where we really need to get into, kind of dip our foot a little bit deeper into what we're talking about here, because again, like I said before, riches, wealth, those sorts of things in and of themselves are not bad. They're not evil. But when we're seeing the language here in chapter 17 as it relates to sexual immorality, we kind of get a little bit of a bigger clue as to what we're dealing with here. Now, obviously, since we're dealing with the term, with the picture of a prostitute, and then the description of sexual immorality, I mean, those two descriptions seem to go together. But even when you look at how prostitutes are described in other parts of Scripture, you get this sense that a prostitute or a wayward woman is somebody who lures somebody away into destruction, because they're luring them away into evil and destruction. And that sort of thing. And in a broader, more general, overarching sense, I think one of the things that you could say is that when it comes to the sexual immorality, it's talking about sexual immorality in the sense that things that draw people away from the one true God. Okay. Now, sexual immorality can also be literal here too, because one of the things that you saw in the ancient world were temple prostitutes and religious prostitutes and that sort of thing. Prostitution that was connected to different pagan religions, and in which case, the sexual immorality was very much literal. So I think certainly you can be dealing with both as it relates to the first century context. The literal sexual immorality, which wasn't an unknown thing, but also even in a spiritual level. So even if you weren't dealing with an actual prostitute within your religious system, there is sexual immorality from a biblical understanding, where that sort of thing denotes this whole thing of being drawn away from the one true God, and living in rebellion against Him and going towards the things of the world and that sort of thing. Just to give you an Old Testament understanding, just as it relates to the description of prostitutes and things like that. Again, I think more from a spiritual perspective, but in Nahum chapter 3 and verse 4, it says, "and all of the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and hold on. Yeah, verse 4. And all of the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms. Notice that, deadly charms. Who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms. Okay. So there you see just kind of the description of prostitute there. And again, I think that this is more along the lines of seeing this from a spiritual perspective, and what that is. Now, again, like I said, this whole thing is, and we see initially here in verse 2 is connected to the kings of the earth, as it says there, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. But notice what else verse 2 goes on to say. It says, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. Okay, so we're not just talking about kings of the earth. We're not even just talking exclusively about all those people who are wealthy and just want to get more wealth and want to do everything of that nature, detached from everything having to do with the one true God. We're dealing with, as it says there, as it says there in the middle of verse 2, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. Now, we become all too familiar throughout this entire study of the book of Revelation. It's shown up in many places where the dwellers of the earth is a designation given to people of the world who are unbelievers, right? That's what it's supposed to denote. That's what it's supposed to describe here. And dwellers of the earth, being unbelievers, can cover all sorts of categories. It can cover rich, it can cover middle class, it can cover poor. You know, the idea here is that of people who are unbelievers. Okay, regardless of class or social status or whatever like that. Okay, so that's who we're dealing with as well. Now the language here is interesting because it says, and with the wine of whose sexual immoralities the dwellers on earth have become drunk. So we're not dealing with anything where we're talking about, you know, just a simple sort of thing of just drinking, you know, these sorts of things and just partaking here and there. We're talking about excess. When we're talking about drunk, what we're supposed to get in our minds is excess. And we've kind of seen some of these things here a little bit, you know, to a certain extent. If you remember back in chapter 14, and in verse 8 it was, where it says, another angel, a second, followed, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Now, underline that term in your mind, Babylon the Great, because we see it here in our passage in chapter 17. But again, here in chapter 14, verse 8, it says, another angel, a second, followed, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Okay, so really, we're just, the cat's out of the bag really right now, you know, who this prostitute is. This prostitute is Babylon the Great. And again, we'll talk about things in a little bit of a reminder sense here in a couple minutes here of what we're supposed to draw from that. This prostitute who is also, you know, described as Babylon the Great. But there you see, we've come upon this language before. And it seems like intense language there in chapter 14 as well. She who made all the nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Okay, and here in chapter 17, we see that the dwellers of the earth are drunk on the wine of her sexual immorality. Okay, so the kings of the earth and the dwellers of the earth are all in the same boat here. They're all interacting with this prostitute and engaging in these sexual immoralities that are detached, obviously, from the one true God and the things of God. Okay, and that's a big distinction from people who are believers, who are of the church, and who don't engage in those sorts of things. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't the same kind of allure, you know, or anything like that towards the people toward believers and that sort of thing. And we'll talk about that in a minute, in a little bit here. But here we get this. We see the obvious scene that's laid out here is that the people of the world, you know, rich or poor, or whatever like that, are engaged with the prostitute to a point of excess here, and that's something that, you know, look around in our world today, you can certainly see that. It wasn't an unforeseen and unknown thing in the first century either, okay, and that sort of thing. So there you have that description in verse 2. Now when you get into verse 3, it says, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns." Now I want to take this time, just from reading that verse there, to let you in on a couple of contrasts. One that we can draw straight out, right out of the box, just based on what we've seen before, and then another that we're going to be exposed to a little bit later, okay, in connection to what we see here in chapter 17. But notice that this is a woman. This prostitute is described as a woman who sits on a scarlet beast, okay? And this is all taking place in the wilderness. Again, he carried me away in the spirit. So we know this is a visionary sort of thing. We saw the same thing at the beginning of chapter 4. Carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. Now we've been, and again, I think in a metaphorical, symbolic sort of sense, we've been in the wilderness before in the book of Revelation with a dragon, right? And a woman, right? In chapter 12, we saw a woman in the wilderness who was fleeing from the dragon, who was trying to drown her with the river of water, the deluge of water that came from the dragon's mouth. Now, of course, the woman was protected. The earth opened up and swallowed up that torrent or whatever. But there you see the whole thing where you have the dragon and the woman in the wilderness. So you see enmity between those two things. Now here in chapter 17, we see a contrast to that, where we see the beast, not the dragon, but the beast. But of course, the beast it gets his authority from the dragon, according to chapter 13. We see a beast and a woman in the wilderness, and these two are allies. Okay. Now, there's one contrast that you have, but the bigger, and I would say even more important contrast that we see here is between what we see here in chapter 17 and what we're going to see in chapter 21. And I'll just introduce it here, just very briefly, and I'll remind you of it when we get back to when we get to this point much later in chapter 21. But it's helpful for us to see this so that we understand a little bit better what we're dealing with here. And this is a contrast between good and evil. Okay. Here it says, notice again, let me just draw your attention back to verse 1, where where the angel says to John, says, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters." And then skip down to verse 3, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting," blah, 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 and there you get the description there. We'll cover the blah, 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 blah in a few minutes. Okay. But if you were to avert your gaze to chapter 21, we see similar language here, but we see a contrast. Okay. And so in verse 9 of Revelation 21, it says, "Then came one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the last plagues and spoke to me, saying, 'Come, I will show you the bride.'" Now, remember in chapter 17, one of the angels says, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the prostitute," and that sort of thing. Here it's saying, "Come, I will show you the bride." So there's a contrast there, where you have the contrast between the prostitute that we see in chapter 17 and also in chapter 18, and the bride, which actually this isn't the first time the bride is mentioned here in Revelation in chapter 21. We're going to talk more about the church as the bride in chapter 19. But, so by the time we get to chapter 21, we're familiar with the bride. The bride is the church. And that's not unknown to you and me. We know the church as the bride of Christ, right? So it says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the spirit," again, all similar language, "to a great high mountain," not a wilderness, but a high mountain, "and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance, and like a most rare jewel," blah, 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 blah. Okay. And we'll talk about the blah, 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 blah in chapter 21 when we get to chapter 21. Okay. But I hope you saw the similar language there. And I hope you see, and again, I'll remind you of this when we get to this point, that when it talks about the New Jerusalem is not a literal city. The New Jerusalem in its descriptions is a symbolic picture of the bride of Christ, which is the church. Okay. Because, it says, "Come, I will show you the bride." And John is taken away in the spirit to a high mountain and shown the holy city, Jerusalem. What's he looking at there? He's looking, in other words, the holy city, Jerusalem, is the bride of Christ. The bride of Christ is the church. Therefore, the New Jerusalem is the bride of Christ. And again, we'll talk in greater depth in that when we get there. Okay. So here, drawing our attention back to chapter 17, here we have the first formula of that contrast, where the angel is saying, "Come, I will show you." He's taken away in the spirit, but in this passage, he's taken away into the wilderness, and he's shown the prostitute. So the prostitute and the bride, two very different women in this whole unfolding of the book of Revelation here. Okay. And so there you see a couple of the contrasts that we're dealing with there. So, carried away into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Now, if memory serves me correctly, I think that this is the first time we're given the color of the beast. I don't think the color of the beast was disclosed in chapter 13. This obviously, just based on the description of the beast in this passage, is the same beast that we saw in chapter 13 and also saw briefly in chapter 11. But the descriptions here in chapter 17 are the same that we saw in chapter 13, except here we're told that it's a scarlet beast. And I think the one significance that we would have there is that, when we're talking, we saw in chapter 13 that the beast received his authority from the dragon, and the dragon was one who was described as red. Okay. So there, I think you see, that, that what we're dealing with here is, we see a clear connection here between the beast and the dragon in another way. Okay. So that's what we're dealing with. So there you, again, in a very subtle way, we see the spiritual implications of everything here with the harlots or the prostitute's connection with the beast and her encounters and interactions with the kings of the earth and the dwellers of the earth. Okay. Here's the familiar language here. So the woman is sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. And again, in chapter 13, we saw, how the beast had blasphemous names written on it, and how it blasphemed God and God's people and that sort of thing. Had blasphemous name, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay. Now, the one thing that I'll just mention here, and there's more detail to this. And again, there's an explanation as to the meaning of the 7 heads and the 10 horns in the next section here. We're going to get into that next time. But one of the things that we did talk about as it relates to the 7 heads and the 10 horns and everything, really just the description of the beast in general. The description of the beast in general, remember what I said before, is that we're not dealing with a single end times individual. We're not even dealing with an individual, but we're dealing with several manifestations between the first and second comings of Christ that exhibit an anti-Christian, anti-God, anti-Christ sort of dealings, to the point that, it's given authority over every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, everything like that. But it also makes war with the saints and conquers them. Okay. Now, that's not just an individual beast in one particular time in history. Like I said, the beast is manifest throughout church history, and you can put several names to that. The first century name that a lot of people were familiar with, and with the mark of the beast of the first century would have been understood by the hearers of Revelation, was Nero. Okay. So that's just a little bit of a small review of the beast and what we've covered as it relates to the beast. Now, as it relates specifically to the 7 heads and the 10 horns, again, we're not going to go into detail here because it's not covered here. It's covered in the next section that we're going to cover next time. Okay, but just keep that in your minds. The description of the beast, it has seven heads and 10 horns. Now, verse 4, it says the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. Okay, now you could look at this in a couple of ways. Purple and scarlet together can be the color of garments that were worn by people who were rich and wealthy, which, again, given what we're dealing with here, is not altogether unusual. It's not, okay? But at the same time, some people might look at this and say, well, it's interesting that one of the things that she wears is scarlet because she's riding on a scarlet beast. So does the scarlet identify her with the scarlet beast, who in turn is associated with the dragon? I mean, it could be. With purple, having to do with royalty, a color of royalty. That's also something that was not unknown or in the ancient world or whatever. So it's possible that it could be associated in that sort of way as well. But one thing that we will see in chapter 18 is that both purple and scarlet, as far as clothing and everything, is connected to the riches within the whole area of commerce and merchandise and things like that. So I think, again, just the whole thing of her being arrayed in purple and scarlet is to point to that reality, along with what we see here in the other part of verse 4 here. Says, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. Okay, so again, you're supposed to get this understanding that this beast, this prostitute is rich. She's decked out, and it's supposed to be something that's alluring to other people. That's why you have kings of the earth and dwellers of the earth who go into her, and to drink the wine of her sexual immorality. That's the idea that you're supposed to get here. But notice what else she has there. It says, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. So this is the third time that this whole thing of her sexual immorality is mentioned. We've seen it in verse 2 with the kings of the earth, and also with the dwellers of the earth. So we see it seems like we're the angel is wanting John, and John is wanting us to know that sexual immorality is central in what the prostitute is peddling here, of what she's selling, I guess, so to speak, to everybody else. Okay, but but again, going back to the whole thing of what she's holding in her hand, a golden cup. Notice, golden cup full of abominations. So everything even connected to the sexual immorality. You could think of things economically that things will do, that people will do, that is designed to draw people away from the one true God, but connected to those things can be truly awful, wicked and abominable things connected to that. So it's just interesting that description of abominations and sexual immorality is put there together in verse 4. Now, in verse 5, we're told who she is. He says, and on her forehead was written a name of mystery. Now, some translations, unlike mine here, and I'm not sure which one is really the right way, but it says on her forehead was written a name. Some translations say, and on her forehead was written a name, and then part of the name that's quoted says Mystery Babylon the Great. Now mine here, it says, and on her forehead was written a name of mystery. And then it says what that name of mystery is. That is Babylon the Great. Okay. However way you look at it, I think mystery is going to mean the same thing here. This is what we're dealing with here, and the fact that this is that her name, what's written on her forehead, is labeled as a mystery. I don't think it's supposed to give us the impression that there are things about her that are mysterious now. They're not mysterious now but they're a mystery, and they've now been revealed, and we're going to see everything behind the prostitute's sinister plan and her sinister dealings. We're seeing that right now, as well as the sinister actions and behaviors of the beast and the kings of the earth and that sort of thing. But that's what we're seeing here. But it's she's given this name of mystery, and her name is called Babylon the Great. Now, again, like I said, we've seen Babylon the Great before. I read in chapter 14, verse in chapter 14 and verse 8, how it's talking about Babylon the Great. We saw Babylon the Great in the previous section that we looked at last time we were in Revelation, in chapter 16, in verse 19, where it says, "The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great, to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath." Okay. And we talked about how, the connection between Babylon the Great and then the great city, and how he said that those two are the same. And we've also seen the great city described in here as well, in the book of Revelation. And I'll remind you of that as well. But in talking about Babylon the Great and what we've talked about in those times where it's resurfaced. Remember, Babylon doesn't exist, and I don't think it will exist, in the future or anything like that. It's totally, completely fallen. But Babylon, again, if we're looking at this from a symbolic sort of way, and what this is supposed to generate in the minds of John's audience here, is supposed to generate this idea of enemies of God and enemies of God's people. Okay. That's really what you're dealing with especially when you're looking at this from an Old Testament context. The people of Israel, who were the people of God at that time, at least in the southern kingdom, how they were deported, by the Babylonians to the land of Babylon, right? And so you get that association of Babylon as being enemies of God and enemies of the people of God, even though God sovereignly used Babylon to carry out his purposes against other nations and even against the people of Israel. That still doesn't take away from the fact that these were enemies of God and enemies of his people, and that's what we're supposed to draw from here. Now, the fact that we're talking about Babylon, the enemies of the people of God. This is supposed to give us an understanding here that what we're dealing with here is not again, just like the prostitute and just like the beast, we're not dealing with one specific city or one specific location. This is something that spans all throughout church history between the first and second comings of Christ. You might even say even before the time of Christ, because the spirit of all of those things, the spirit of Babylon the Great, the spirit of enmity with God and against God's people has predated even the times of Christ. But we're just being given fuller revelation of things and how that's described here in later passages in the Bible. But that's the idea that you get. Now, in the first century context, Babylon the Great would have been Rome and everything that you see with Rome. And, the fact that, the first century context would, readers or hearers would have understood this, you have to understand that Rome was not only in the business from time to time of persecuting God's people and was already persecuting God's people in certain areas of Asia Minor, but Rome was very successful economically at this time. So, there you see, prostitute, Babylon the Great. Well, yeah, sure. So are so many other places in the world back then and all throughout church history and even today. It's a wide range or wide gamut of nations and peoples and everything like that highlights enemy of God, enemy of the people of God and that sort of thing. That's what we're dealing with here. So the prostitute is identified as Babylon the Great. So she is an enemy of God. And the thing is that what we're seeing in what's being symbolically portrayed from her, what we're seeing there is an attack against God's people from a different, tactic. Now, eventually it'll come to the whole thing of the, the blood of the saints and the martyrs and everything like that. But we do see that unlike the beast, there isn't any sort of force or coercion, at least not initially. What we see here is an alluring alluring people into her beauty and wealth and that sort of thing. So it says on her forehead was written the name of mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. So this is all where the source is, where the source is coming from. And remember, ultimately what we're dealing with here is something spiritual, okay? Because the prostitute is riding the beast. So we see her connection to the beast, who in turn is associated with the dragon in the sense that the beast received his authority from the dragon, okay? So really, I would really venture to make a case that when it comes to this whole thing of, full of, where it says mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations, where I think what we're talking about here in its true full force, what we're dealing with here is the source that comes from the evil spiritual realm. And we see that in expressions in the prostitute and everything like that. So we're told that, the prostitute is Babylon the Great. And again, just as I just reminded you what we've talked about as far as Babylon the Great, and what that looks like. And by the way, I also said there when we look back at chapter 16, verse 19, the connection between the great city and Babylon the Great. Remember, we've seen the great city in Revelation chapter 11, and in I believe it's in verse 8 when it's talking about the death of the two witnesses. It says, "And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom." In what's Sodom known for? It's known for a lot of its abominations, abominable behaviors, particularly in sexual immorality as well, right? And Egypt, which is, we know, best known for their oppression of the people of God in slavery before the Exodus, and it says where their Lord was crucified, which points your mind to Jerusalem. And maybe that's, and again, as I said before, maybe that's pointing to the, unbelieving Jews as well. But so there again, you see that description of the great city, which clearly shows things having to do with things against God and the things of God and against God's people. Then in chapter 16, you see the great city associated with Babylon the Great. And so all of that is to say that works into what we've been talking about as far as the prostitute, how she's an enemy of God and to the people of God and to the things of God, right? So now in verse 6, John continues and he says, "And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." Okay, so again, we're talking about drunkenness here, drunk on the blood of the saints, the martyrs of Jesus, the witnesses of Jesus. Okay, so we have this aspect of persecution there. Now notice drunk, which means we're talking about excess here. So there have been a lot of people, a lot of believers whose blood has been shed for the name of Jesus Christ. And the prostitute is connected in some way to that. Now we might wonder why that is, or how that is. Well, I think that her riding of the beast is one thing. But again, we have to understand, just kind of in a lot of ways of how this worked. Again, I'll take your mind back to what we talked about a long time ago, having to do with the church in Thyatira. How many of those people were in trades and they had to associate themselves with trade guilds. But the only problem is that those trade guilds were associated with a patron deity, and as part of your activity within those guilds required worship of that patron deity and certain rituals and worship and things like that, which any true Christian could not take a part of and would not take a part of. And if they didn't take part in that, then they were kicked out and they couldn't make wealth, and so that they couldn't buy or sell. Remember how we talked about that in relation to the mark of the beast and how that would have been understood in the first century context. In some way, we're dealing with the same thing here, in the sense that you're wanting to make wealth. That's why you're in the trade. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but when you're having to go through some sort of very sinful, system where that requires worship of other deities, The prostitute would be one who says, look, you can come in, just you can get this wealth for yourself. You can take care of yourself. You can take care of your family. It's no big deal, blah, blah, blah. And so the lure is seeing the wealth that you need, or maybe in the things that you want, and then having this whole thing, the strings attached, and saying that it needs to be connected to the worship of this patron deity, which would be in connection to the beast. That's a manifestation of the beast there. And remember, the prostitute rides the beast. That's how those things are connected. Now, there's a further deeper connection, I think, in the sense that, those who refuse to follow through in that Thyatiran system, if they refuse, the whole thing is that they would lose their job and they wouldn't be able to make a living. So how does the blood of the saints come in? How does that figure into the picture? Well, if we're dealing with the church, ideally, that not only refuses to enter into that system for the sake of gaining wealth to take care of themselves and that sort of thing, but also as members of the church who are not going to be silent about their testimony in Jesus. And you read about the testimony of Jesus and how people suffer for that. The testimony of Jesus, these are people who still talk about Jesus. They still preach Jesus. They still share the gospel and everything. So we're dealing with people who are saying, not only are we not going to enter into that and participate in these festivals that have to do with these patron deities in these guilds and will make us lose our jobs. Not only that, but Jesus is the true and only way. And he alone is the one that you should worship. When you continue to go along that route, the lure isn't working. And so now the beast is going to come in and going to say, oh, really? Jesus is the only way. He's the only one that you worship. And then that's where the oppression comes in from the beast. Because remember, the beast makes war with the saints and conquers them. So you kind of see an intertwining sort of thing between the prostitute and the beast, and the sense that you get is that with the prostitute who is drunk on the blood of the saints, we're dealing with a prostitute that has absolutely no qualms whatsoever in seeing the destruction of God's people. That again clues you into this idea that we're dealing with an enemy of God's people. Okay. So that's what we see there. That's what we're being exposed to as it relates to all of this. Okay. So again, as it says there, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Now, still in the middle of verse 6 and then going into verse 7 here, it says, when I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. Okay, so the highlight here in the last part of verse is seen probably there in the last part of verse 6 there. When John described, it says, when I saw her, that is the prostitute, I marveled greatly. And so you've had some people who will say that, when it says that John marveled, it's saying he marveled at the beauty of the prostitute and just the allure and the beauty of that. And so it was kind of something that really was really attractive to John's eyes. And then you have other people that kind of object to that and say, no, that's probably not it. I mean, again, after all, this is a prostitute who's drunk on the blood of the saints and everything like that. And that sort of thing. We understand what the prostitute is standing for. That can't be something that's alluring to the church. I say, oh, really? So I'm one who tends to think that along these lines, what John is saying, and his whole description of saying that I looked at her, when I saw her, I marveled, and then he gets the answer there. It says, but the angel said to me, why do you marvel? Why? It almost has an air of it's inappropriate for you to marvel. You shouldn't be marveling at this. And so when the angel says, I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns that carries her. I think the idea, and we'll get the sense of this, as we go further in the passage, is that what you see of the harlot is not. It's not all that it's cracked up to be. we're gonna see the fate of the woman here. I mean, we saw it already because we read through the entire chapter. But when we dissect that part, when we come to that part, we see that the woman herself is going to be doomed by the beast and some of the other kings as well. Okay. So there's this alluring, and John is looking, he's amazed at this beauty and everything. And it's almost as if the angel, and this is how I see it anyway, the angel's like, things are not what they seem to be. Don't get drawn into that. And I think the message is the same thing that you can tell to people in the church, believers. Okay. Because if we were to look at this from the opposing perspective to say, no, that can't be what it's talking about. We see the prostitute for what she really is. How could there be any allure like that? I say, well, all you have to do is look at Laodicea. Remember one of the things that I said after we looked at the 7 churches, the letter says 7 churches in Asia Minor, how there's 3 kind of main challenges that face the church. And that's persecution, false religion, and materialism. This is where the whole materialism thing comes in. That's a challenge of the church? Well, yeah, absolutely. We're seeing it right here. The prostitute is very alluring. And when you think about, and you see different facets of that in some of those different churches. Remember, we talked about that when we were going through those letters way back in chapters 2 and chapter 3. Laodicea, which Laodicea itself was a rich community, and the church within that rich community was a rich church. And what were the people in Laodicea saying? The people in Laodicea were saying that we are in need of nothing. They were leaving God behind. I mean, I don't think they were like apostatizing necessarily, but they were so dependent on their wealth and so gloried and prideful in their wealth. You know, they said that we aren't in need of anything, but their true description was that they are poor, pitiable, blind, and naked. Which shows you again, just kind of, things were not. I mean, that was one of the 2 letters that didn't have any commendation. We know that there's a serious spiritual issue going on with their connection with Christ. Now, as I said before, I do believe that that with Laodicea, we are dealing with a true, actual church. And we don't have to go into the details of that, why I believe that. Again, we talked about that a while ago. But again, this is a church of Jesus Christ who was so much into their material sort of thing that it's just kind of like they're thinking like, maybe on an unconscious level, maybe they wouldn't say this explicitly, but their behavior would seem to indicate that we don't need God. We're full. We got everything here. And that's something that churches like Laodicea would have to be careful of. And the goings on of the church in Laodicea is just one example of what you see in history between the first and second comings of Christ within different churches throughout the whole world. Okay? Not every church, obviously. But again, that exhibits one of the challenges that the church has to face in different areas of the world throughout different times in church history. And I think that that's what you have there. Okay? There's that alluring there that can even capture even the church. And so when John is saying, I'm amazed, I marveled greatly, the angel's like, why are you marveling? Listen, I'm going to tell you that, this is things are not what they appear to be. And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen and what's going to unfold. I think that's essentially what the angel is saying. And just a quick, just kind of example of this, even from the Old Testament, of what this might look like. I'm not saying that this is a one-for-one comparison, but it's something that's seen in a similar vein. And this just came to mind just as I was doing my own personal reading in Scripture. But in Joshua, you remember how the Israelites had entered the Promised Land. They'd already defeated Jericho, and they were going against Ai. Now, remember, one of the things they said about Jericho, it says, when you destroy Jericho, don't take any of the devoted things. Those are devoted to destruction. But then the gold and silver and the iron and those sorts of things, those are reserved for the Lord. You are not to take any of those things. So, but Achan took some of those things and hid them in his tent, so that when the Israelites went out against Ai, they got beat down the first time, and they're wondering what's going on. And God says, one of you has sinned by taking the devoted things that I told you specifically not to touch and not to take into your possession. And so when it was found out that Achan was the one, in Joshua chapter 7, verse 20, it says, and Achan answered Joshua, truly I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful cloak from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, then I coveted them and took them. And see, they are hidden in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath. And listen, this was Achan did this even when they were explicitly told not to do this and explicitly warned what would happen if they did so. So this isn't a mystery to Achan, or even the consequences aren't a mystery either. And yet you see Achan, because it says there, he coveted it. He coveted it. And his covetous heart went after what was beautiful in his eyes as it related to these things here, and he took them in direct rebellion to what the Lord said, and putting the rest of his Israelite brothers in jeopardy as it related to war. Okay. Now, again, let me just reiterate, this isn't to say that gold or silver or anything like that in and of itself is bad, and that whenever it comes to silver or gold or anything like that, those things are untouchable. And we especially know this in the story of Joshua, because in chapter 8, when they're getting ready to go after Ai again, after Achan had been taken care of because of his sin, it says in verse 2, and you shall do to Ai and its kings as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. So this wasn't a situation where it says hands off, just like it was with Jericho. God is saying, yeah, okay, you can have the spoils of Ai. That's okay. So we know that in and of itself, the spoils of those things, which would include silver and gold and everything like that, in and of itself, it's not bad. Nor is having those things bad. But Achan is a good picture of how the allure of gold and riches and stuff can override what we know to be right and what we know to be true. So that just like Achan, there can be so many people as it relates to wealth, riches, and that sort of thing, can be lured into those things that draws them away, whether consciously or unconsciously, from God and to the things of God. And, the warning is, don't get drawn in by that. Laodicea had kind of that problem. They were embracing their wealth more than they were embracing God, to the point they say that we are in need of nothing. And the Lord was saying, you are sorely mistaken as far as your condition in my sight. Okay. So when it comes to John marveling here, the angel says, hold on. Why are you marveling? Why are you marveling? Let me show you what is going to become of this whole thing. I will show you what's going to take place. The beauty that you see is not everything that it appears to be. And this woman is going to be in peril. And listen, by the way, isn't it interesting? Did you notice? Understand, we're dealing with a prostitute that's riding the beast. How does John overlook the beast? Because it says, when I saw her, I marveled greatly. Wait a minute. She's riding a beast. Did you not see that? And aren't you familiar with the beast? We've come up on the beast before. But no, John's eyes are locked on the woman. And when he sees the woman, he says, when I saw her, I marveled greatly. We got to be careful of that too. And we live in a day and an age in a culture where what you have and the materials that you have, it's propagated and it's blared in your face as if this is what defines who you are. You need to keep up with the Joneses. You don't have this, you don't have that. Man, you're behind the times. You don't have this, you don't have that, blah, blah, blah. That sort of thing. Everything, what you have is what's most important. And if that means, keeping up with society to keep up with society, to loosen up on some of the things having to do with your religion, with your devotion to Christ and that sort of thing, let go of those things a little bit and just kind of delve in a little bit here. It's okay. It's okay. And before you know it, compromise starts to happen. And before you know it, you're down a deep rabbit hole. Now, since we are in Christ, God is not going to let us go down a path that we're lost or anything like that, or that we lose our salvation or anything like that. That's not what we're talking about. God disciplines those that he loves. And in fact, that's what he told Laodicea, right? So it's not outside of the realm of possibility that God brings his disciplining hand to bring us back to the path of holiness. But let's keep that in mind. And by the way, this whole mentality doesn't have to be for people who are rich or prosperous already. You can be poor and be a materialist. That could be another thing. Some people might say, doesn't this perspective seem a little bit Western or more American, because there are a lot of churches in other parts of the world that are poor or impoverished? Well, no, the lure is just as real for them. It might even be more real for them because they don't have as much as people perhaps here in the United States or in other parts of the world. And they have to be careful of that as well. That could look even more alluring to them, especially to them. Okay. So as we have this all in our mind, we're left with this whole thing of the angels are going to show John what's going to happen to the prostitute and to the beast. And he's going to start out by talking about what happens to the beast. And that's what we're going to pick up on next time. Listen, friends, Jesus Christ is our sufficiency. He's our everything. It's okay to have things. It's okay to have a lot of things as long as you have it from a particular perspective. There are godly men and women in the Bible who are rich, and they're not condemned for it. But understand what truly is rich, and that's your standing in Christ. And that compared to that, everything else in this world doesn't mean squat. Okay. And so we can't be fooled by the alluring of switching that mindset and saying that, no, it does mean squat if you have this, and this. And if it means having to compromise in some of the things having to do with your relationship with Christ in order to get those things, then so be it. No. Don't go that direction. Because that's the lure. That's the draw. And we can't fall for that. And just as John is being shown, we're being shown what we see here is not the full story as it relates to the prostitute. Just wait until you see what happens to her. And we're going to see that soon as it relates to this chapter in chapter 17. Okay, so to be continued. We will leave it there for now. If you enjoy the show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, or Spotify. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? Again, I will leave a link to the Amazon page in the episode description so that you can go there directly and order yourself a copy. All right. Great examination of the Word. Enjoyed it as I always do. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.